Welcome to today's YouGovern webcast on entrepreneurship, privatization, contracts, and risks. This project is a collaboration between Faculty in Planning at Geography, Planning and International Development Studies Department at University of Amsterdam, the YouGovern Network, and the urban school Sciences Po Paris, and is generously funded by Center of Urban Studies at the University of Amsterdam. We had 2 in-person discussion sessions and 1 webcast where we discussed the risks associated with privatization and contractual governance in this session. Legal scholars, planners, and urban studies scholars contributed their insights with a focus on the real estate and infrastructure sectors throughout the project. YouGovern, the Urban Governance Research Network, is an international academic network, and we have the mission to generate, support, and disseminate interdisciplinary governance research. Our platform is built upon 4 interrelated research themes: urban planning, property markets, spatial regulation, and law and policy. By uniting diverse expertise, we aim to unravel the complexities of governance in urban spaces and contribute to informed decision-making and sustainable development of cities. The webcast is moderated by Dr. Champaka Rajagopal, who is affiliated with Sciences Po Paris at the Urban School and visiting faculty at Azim Premji University, where she coordinates the Hub for Law and Policy. I'm Tuna Tashankok, Professor of Urban Governance and Planning and the Research Group Program Director of Urban Planning at the University of Amsterdam. I'm the discussant and host of this session. Together with Champaka, we explored context-dependent understandings and consequences of contractual governance, especially focusing on the Dutch and Indian context. For this interdisciplinary discussion session, we invited 3 experts to brainstorm about the idea of contractual governance to discuss diverse understandings of contracts and the meaning of contractual governance. Dr. Sukriti Isar, Associate Professor of Sociology at Sciences Po, is the scientific advisor of governing the Large Metropolis Masters program at the Urban School. Jagan Shah is a visiting senior fellow at Arta Global, which is a policy organization that supports governments, and CEO of Infravision Foundation, which is an independent think tank in shaping and evaluating India's public policy. Dr. Michiel Stapper is an assistant professor at Tilburg Law School. His research explores how legal and regulatory frameworks create moral beings and contribute to the fields of participatory governance, urban politics, and social-legal studies. In this webcast, we started the discussion by reflecting on 2 interrelated questions to create an interdisciplinary discussion. How do you look at contracts, and what does contractual governance mean at your work?
Research. So to start with, I think if the question is how do I look at contracts, or how does governance in Indian cities really respond to contractual arrangements? I guess there are different ways of articulating the question, but I think what is fundamental is that there is an assumption in the Indian city that the citizen has a social contract with the state, right? So there is an assumption. It's tacit. It is not spelled out. It probably cannot be spelled out, but there is an assumption nevertheless. So the responsibility of public service delivery falls on the state, and this stems from the expectation that the citizen has from the state. In the Indian constitutional structure, this is driven by directive principles of state policy. So it's not it's not defined in very specific terms, but broadly in terms of principles that must inform state policy and inform governance. And these tend to be actually ideals. And therefore, whatever we see in terms of policy frameworks and regulatory frameworks and implementation processes are, in a sense, derived from the directive principles, but not in a very exact way. So they're all different articulations of this, and particularly made complicated because India is a federal structure. So under the Constitution of India, land management and municipal administration are assigned as areas where the state government or the provincial government actually has the jurisdiction. So it is not the national government that decides, it is the state government that decides. So if we look at a three-tiered hierarchy in terms of governance of cities, there is a national level, there is a state level, and then there is the local government. And this hierarchy and the relationship between the three has been a contested space. It's not cast in stone. It was not written into the original constitution. In fact, the devolution of powers to the third level, which is the local level, that devolution of powers was actually for the first time described in 1992. So it's as recent as that in that sense. So almost 40 years, 35 years after independence, we actually created the 74th Amendment to the Indian Constitution, which actually talks about devolution of powers to local authorities. So you can imagine that in that sense, the legal, regulatory, contractual aspects of the relationship between state and citizens is still very much in formation. It's incipient. And these directive principles have been, in some fundamental sense, the basis for developing governance structures. So the ways in which our central ministries or state departments are divided, they tend to follow the directive principles in terms of what the state should deliver. It should deliver health, it should deliver education, it should deliver social justice and such like. So this also, in a sense, dictates broadly the architecture of the state. But moving on to how contracts play into this is, I would use the word approximation. Everything that we see in Indian cities is an approximation of a legally binding contract, but it is almost never a legally binding contract. So it follows from a patriarchal or paternalistic state that is bound by directive principles of state policy to deliver public goods and services, and therefore it in a sense stands in for what you would expect is a contractual relationship. So it only approximates, and the approximations are numerous. So the Indian state has experimented with levels of service, for instance, LOS, right? So what should be the frequency at which a bus should run, or what should be the level of service with regard to giving you a water connection. So, it's tried to commit itself in various ways. Different state governments try and come out with citizen charters, and using such lofty and romantic notions like citizen charters, try and approximate what should be a contract, but it never becomes a contract. So the assurance of the delivery of the social contract and all of its letter and spirit, that assurance is never pinned down. And so this shows a hesitation on the side of the state to actually commit itself, possibly because of the legacy of lack of capacity, right? So possibly because the state doesn't have the full breadth of capacity that it requires to be able to give that level of assurance. Now, I heard mention in the beginning about public-private partnership. Now, that's an interesting dimension to this, because when it comes down to the state going into PPP concessioner agreements and such like, it foists all of the risk onto the private sector and says, well, now the private sector has the obligation to deliver, as per levels of service, at a very fixed cost and so on. And when the private sector finds to its surprise that it's unable to do so, the state refuses to negotiate the contract. And so India has been also a graveyard of public-private partnerships. We are seldom able to make a PPP work because the state is foisting its risk always onto the private sector. So there is that approximation, which then leads to a vagueness. So I would say the second key word for me is the approximation creates the problem of vagueness of transfers, of responsibility being assigned to the right parties and so on. And further complicated by the fact that India has, over the last decade, adopted the digital mode of delivering governance. So when government becomes faceless, then the approximation, you can well imagine, becomes, in a sense, converted into an algorithm. And while that's a complete contradiction, how can an algorithm be approximate? But essentially, the algorithm is then designed to absolve the government of responsibility. So that's where the government begins to then outsource services. So you could go to a municipal website to pay your property tax, and then you will be bounced from that website to a private site, a service provider, and in between there will be a tiny little box that says, it's a disclaimer and says you're going to a private domain, and if you have a problem, you can stop. But then how can you? I mean, you don't have a choice. You've got to pay your tax. So the government is then playing tricks. It gets into from approximation to vagueness to playing tricks, in order to continue to absolve itself of responsibility. And the most significant aspect of this is that India has not been able to develop tort laws. So while the courts are, every now and then, if a case lands in front of the judges, which involves, say, for instance, somebody falling into a municipal sewer line and dying, or for that matter, municipal workers who are asphyxiated because of gases in the sewer lines, or such like, or an electric pole falls on somebody. If such a case were to land up in court, the judges will haul up the municipal authorities and say, pay compensation. So then, from approximation to vagueness to avoidance, then we come to the point of monetary compensation, which is another form of avoidance, because we are still not committing ourselves in any kind of contractual way in any kind of binding way to delivering public goods. So I think, to close, I think one of the fundamental problems that this poses for us, or a challenge that it poses, is that we, in the Indian context in particular, and perhaps this resonates in other countries, we need to be extremely mindful of liability and definition of liability. Who is liable? Because, following on Jeremy Bentham, I mean, the state is it's a gargantuan state. It's also, a sum of all of its parts. And yet each part has to be then dissected or separated, and liability ought to be defined. And I think this is a whole area of scholarship which is not so well defined in the Indian context, not so well developed. There isn't enough scholarship going on. And I can say this with some confidence, because 2 weeks ago I was at the Judicial Academy at the National Law School of India, where I happened to be in a closed-door deposition before a Supreme Court judge and a High Court judge who wanted to know about evictions of slums. And they just wanted to understand the subject better. And we got to know that they actually understand very little about cities altogether, and are thirsty for more knowledge. And this is precisely because case law doesn't necessarily give you enough insight. And so that, for me, was a revelation. My last point really is going to be that all of this has become, and this I think is a discourse which is somewhat insidious and nefarious across many countries, especially authoritarian regimes, is that we've started talking about fundamental rights versus fundamental duties. right? So where the state has actually failed over 75 years in the Indian context to deliver on its social contract, it has now shifted the responsibility back onto the citizen. To say, for instance, that if the street is not clean, actually it's your responsibility to make sure it's clean. So it's beginning to then now play around with actually shifting the focus away from itself onto the citizen herself or himself. And so in that context, I think the discourse of right to the city, which developed around the time of the formation of the SDG agenda in 2015, that concept which came out of Latin America is really strong, is really important, but it needs to have a sharper edge. We need to not make it purely a humanitarian or social justice agenda, but actually to give it that legal sharp edge. And I believe that the way that will come about, and this is my last point, is to actually begin to define clearly what are our rights and obligations with regard to commons, to actually begin to legally describe what the city or the right to the city really means in terms of your relationship with an aggregation of population. Because a city thrives on aggregation, and yet we don't actually, because we are NIMBYs at heart, and because we are, we keep talking about the death of the commons, we do not take responsibility for our role in the aggregation logic. And I think beginning to legally explore the commons as being a legal entity, not just from customary law as Eleanor Ostrom describes it, but really begin to push it into the realm of legality and obligations that individuals have to safeguard the aggregation. I don't believe that we'll really come to terms with this overall sort of dilemma or conundrum. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. That was very rich, especially the multiple conceptual orientations that you bring forward in terms of how one can read the nature of social contract that exists in the Indian context with respect to urban development and with respect to cities, and also points towards many of the discussions we've had in the past about citizenship in cities in India as well, what the meaning of citizenship is, and how that translates into questions related to rights and obligations and the right to the city itself. Thank you very much, Javan.
If we talk about contracts and its role on cities and urban planning and urban politics, I think we have to understand two things. What do we mean by contracts, and why are contracts so popular nowadays in urban planning and in urban politics? And I think we often see contracts as these written agreements, these documents that are being signed, and then everything is fixed, and they are being used to govern urban development projects and other urban projects. But sometimes it's quite complicated to understand what actually a contract is. Because if you only look towards what is written down, that's not the whole contract. And it's also not the whole contract according to courts. Because especially if we think about urban planning and urban development projects, those projects go on for many years, and a lot changes during that period. And it's not that a contract is frozen in time or set in stone, and that there's no flexibility. And it's very common to have all kinds of adjustments, and those adjustments can be in writing, but they can also be oral. And there's also been many court cases where oral commitments have also been considered to be part of a contract. Moreover, it's sometimes hard to say that difficult to claim that a contract is legally binding, because yes, certain parts of contracts are legally binding, but not all the parts of a contract are legally binding. Sometimes they have references to other projects. They have all kinds of commitments within a contract that are more of promises, but they cannot be legally binding. So a contract can be a mix of oral commitments and written commitments about has binding parts and non-binding parts. So actually, contract is quite a complex thing in itself. And I think it's always useful to think about contracts in some kind of continuum of enforceability, where some parts are more enforceable than others. And that it's good to see like a contract as a set of relations that are to a certain extent enforceable, and they are really used to make relations more predictable and to make sure to improve the probability that certain promises will be kept. And I think that is in basically the contract. And if you then compare what a contract is often considered part of private law. So why has contracts become more and more popular as a legal instrument in urban planning and urban politics? And well, my expertise is more like in West Europe and North America, of course. But I think there was a lot of critique on public planning laws as being too rigid. Too fixed. That there was also a critique on bureaucracies to be too slow, and that there was a real need around the 80s to 90s of more flexible planning instruments, because people wanted to stimulate the markets, wanted to give also citizens more space to make decisions rather than top-down public planning kind of approach. So I think there was a certain need and there were certain critiques on urban planning that could be resolved by greater use of contracts. Because contracts can be very specific to a certain cases, of course. They allow for way more flexibility than planning laws, and they're based on negotiation. So they can be more custom-made for specific problems. And and partly also indeed, and I completely agree with Jurgen, that it also allows the government to transfer responsibilities to both citizens and developers and government and other private actors. I think also partly because there was this critique on planning practices as rigid to fixed to top down. And you see like an increase in the use of contracts in urban planning. And I think what resulted in that is that urban planning in terms of legally, but also like more politically, has become more fragmented. That urban planning has become more of focused on projects. So every problem it could be solved through projects. So there's less attention for structural problems, and there's less attention for some kind of comprehensive planning approach. Because everything is being negotiated through contracts, through projects, and you get a very fragmented urban governance structures in, I think, a lot of North American and West European cities, which creates, of course, winners and losers. And I think the winners are those that can benefit from all these negotiations. So these are the developers and the investors, but I think also privileged citizens that know how to negotiate these kind of contracts often can also have a huge impact on urban planning. And I think the losers might sometimes also be the municipalities that have to negotiate all these contracts and keep an overview of all these contracts and promises to other people. But often also the less privileged people that don't have access to all these negotiation processes that are often organized behind closed doors. So I think it has a huge impact. And For me specifically, because in my research I also investigated participatory processes, and in these cities, you see that often first the contract is being signed between a developer and a municipality in the form of a development agreement, and thereafter participatory processes are being organized, which basically means that yes, citizens can have influence on urban development project and they can change things. However, most important decisions are already made by the municipality and developers and formalized through contracts that are often not publicly available, which is also, I think, an important difference with planning laws, that these contracts that govern cities and govern us are not publicly available and that we don't know what's in there. But again, I think we should also not see these contracts as fixed objects, and they can be changed and people can organize to what's in the contracts. However, I think in a grander scale is what I already said, this contractual governance had led to the possibility to make more custom-made plans for specific problems in the city, but at a cost for I think accountability in terms of that we don't know what's in the contracts, but also more fragmented urban governance.
Thank you very much, Michelle. In fact, a lot of the concepts you've invoked speak very closely to Jagan's thoughts as well. And my own research on incomplete contracts is very much discussing similar aspects as well. One reflection that I've had for long is about fragmentation in governance. And I've really continued to try and think about conditions and circumstances under which fragmentation could actually be good, as opposed to being deterrent to social justice or other forms of equitable access to basic services, etc. So it'll be terrific to actually have great, more in-depth discussions on what fragmentation brings about as outcomes to urban governance. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. And I'll just briefly touch on a couple of things that both of the speakers talked about. So I thought the discussion about torts was quite interesting because I recently wrote a paper on nuisance law in India, but in the colonial period. So, 250 years ago in nuisance law. And so that just brought that to mind. And then I'm going to pick up on a couple of points, talk briefly about flexible planning. So my own interest, as I said, is in the regulatory space. And I kind of organized this brief talk around the incomplete contracts idea. But just to briefly start with, if we just take that as a kind of given, and the way that I've always interpreted that is more along the lines of rules, which is that, rules do not include the rules for their own application. And as a result, there's always going to be a gap between policy and practice. It's like that gap is going to be axiomatic. And I always find that interesting because when we study low and middle income countries, we are often told that that gap has to be closed, as if that gap is not axiomatic. And then it's usually meant to be closed with state capacity. But there's also been a lot of increasing literature which sort of says that a large part of that gap might be actually intentional non-enforcement on the part of the state. So it's not just a state capacity argument, it's also the argument of, the state just not willing to deal with certain wicked problems and so on. And then coming more specifically to the question of regulations and zoning. So my own research, which is on FSI, which is floor space index, a very specific policy that deals with building heights in India. And I think it applies also quite widely to other types of urban regulations around the world, including zoning, but also all kinds of building regulations, which always exist together with their exemptions and variances. So the policy almost never exists in just a purely textual form, which is applied in a command and control way. So if you have zoning, you'll always have bonus zoning and incentive zoning. If you have FSI, you'll always have premium FSI and concessions and ways to buy it, and have development rights as well. So essentially, you don't just have the textual policy or the policy as codified, the policy as written document, but you have all these formalized exemptions. So I'm not even going to touch on all the informal exemptions, which people claim for themselves by just not not complying, or the state does not enforce certain things. I'm not talking about those types of exemptions, which also sometimes can completely change the nature of implementation or the built form that might result from a certain regulatory regime. And then I like this quote. It's from Ellickson, who writes a lot about zoning. And he says that judicial insistence on uniform standards, which is a basic way of preventing favoritism in government, is not possible in the case of zoning, because the name itself suggests a system of non-uniform regulation. So again, certain urban regulations, because they can be so place-based, and by place-based, I don't mean urban, I mean like neighborhood-based, building-based, it can really change what regulation or a standard even means. So one of the conclusions that I came out with from my research was very much that this policy exists in a hybrid form. So it exists as a regulatory standard, as a textual standard, but it also exists as a development right, a tax, a development right, a fee, a concession, and a subsidy. So it's always existing in this very hybrid form, from which the conclusion that also arises, my main interest here is very much political economy. So when we're talking about winners and losers, regulations always create winners and losers. But when you have a hybrid regulation, you're also going to have hybrid constituencies, multiple constituencies. And essentially, any moment of policy change is going to impact these different constituencies in different ways. So I think a lot of the debates that we have also about deregulation, or let's say filling that policy practice gap, that debate is tricky, because if the policy already exists in very much an exemption and variance-led world, I think any discussion of policy change has to take that into account. And I really don't think that the current literature on building regulations and on any other type of urban regulatory regime, which is massively impacted by exemptions, which include zoning, I think a lot of that research just focuses on the textual form and does not focus on the entire network of exemptions and variances that exist. Point A. Point B, when it comes to political economy, we assume that the interests can be inferred from the textual form alone. I think this is really a drawback and a limitation of thinking about regulations without taking into account the entire form of them, which is, we can always ask, well, whose interest is the textual form of the policy? But we can also ask, in whose interests are all the exemptions and variances, which, as I said, I'm just focusing on the formal exemptions and variances, not the informal or irregular ones. So that's kind of the questions that I'm trying to push forward, that, this is a hybrid policy. It's got multiple constituencies. So the change to any one part of the policy, or a change to the way exemptions are granted, is going to impact the different constituencies differently. It can actually act as a significant source of friction to policy change. And I would also argue that in some ways it could result in an outcome which is suboptimal for everybody. But it's the only way to keep that, well, I shouldn't say it's the only way, but it's a way that those different interests still hang together, but it is suboptimal. This is how different interests are being placated by the state. And just to end a little bit with the question of municipal, I think we talked about municipal revenue a bit earlier. Because one of the ways that this is kind of intentional, this is very much the way that the state is gaining revenue as well, is through the exemptions. So I think there's an interesting set of actors involved here in maintaining what we could call, we could say that regulations are always going to be incomplete, just as rules are incomplete or contracts are incomplete. That could be seen as axiomatic. But at the same time, when regulations exist in this very exemption-laden world, I think it requires all kinds of different thinking about political economy, whose interests are being served, what kind of flexible planning emerges from this, because the state very much sees these exemptions as a way to flexibilize planning. But I also think that this is a way for the state to really hold a revocable policy instrument in their hands, because it's always a button that they can keep pushing without any kind of blanket regulatory change. So these exemptions are probably much easier to change and to tweak than it would be to change the actual regulatory regime. the regulatory regime is also much more visible. So we were talking about the publicness of some of these contracts and so on. The actual textual regulatory regime is, of course, quite visible. It's, you know, it's textual. It's what gets published the most and thought about the most. But the exemptions are making a pretty big difference as well. They might be not less public, but just less known. So to that extent, it might be more opaque to public scrutiny. And definitely, if people aren't talking about it in this way, it's definitely opaque to public scrutiny. So I think I can stop there. That's pretty much what I wanted to talk about, the way in which this regulation always exists together with its exemptions. And, you know, how does that make us think differently about the interests that are served by this type of very complex hybrid regulations that I think are prevalent in most cities when it comes to zoning and form-based codes. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sukriti. That was excellent. So much of my own practice experience speaks to many of the questions that you've raised, particularly about, you know, I've dealt with exemptions as a given condition across multiple statutory master plans, development plans, not just in India, but in other parts of the world as well. And exceptions are ubiquitous, pretty much. So certainly those reflections are really important also to sort of think about, you know, again, the relationships between non-uniform regulation, for instance, as being incomplete regulations, in a way, incomplete contractual relationships, and how that also speaks to what Michelle brought up in terms of fragmentation, for instance, you know, and there could be some pros and cons of those regulatory circumstances. I'm also very curious to know what you think about scrutiny of some of these regulations, which are in the form of exemptions, because scrutiny itself can become a sort of a double-edged knife in a sense, because it causes risk aversion on the one hand, but it also brings about public transparency on the other. So it'd be interesting to actually have a discussion more in depth on the meaning of scrutiny when it comes to these exemptions. Thank you very much.
Shall I just maybe abstract a bit the discussion? It was extremely interesting, and also to see that actually there is no geographical difference when it comes to contractual relations. It's very similar ways, very similar tools, very similar processes that we see across the world. I would like to maybe start from what Sukriti described there with the hybrid relationships. We had this work some years ago on hybrid contractual landscapes, where we were looking at different regimes of public accountability. And basically listening Jagan and also then Michiel, it comes very clear that what we are going through is the changing role of the state and the private sector and the citizen. In this picture, in this relational picture, I always saw planning as an intermediary tool between the citizen and the state, the citizen and the private sector, or the private sector and the state. But now, if we would imagine this picture, there is no planning, there is all these contracts. Planning almost turns into collection of contracts. It's a very fragmented landscape indeed. And Jagan, you refer to liabilities, and I think that's a very important aspect of this control mechanisms that the state tries to, or the public sector in general, tries to establish by defining certain tools of holding someone accountable for the role that it should actually have, the responsibility against its citizens. Zooming out of this picture, of course, I think we all would agree that this is the whole shift from welfarist forms of state towards neoliberal entrepreneurial forms of state understanding, where roles and responsibilities of the state, and you put it very well, you said again, Jagan, rights and duties. There we see the rights of the state, of the citizen, the duties of the state, of the citizen, and the private industry. It becomes very blurred. In this picture, we cannot see anymore who is responsible for what. And actually we see that, but the mechanisms to measure the liabilities or accountability becomes extremely blurred, not because the contracts are ignoring these liabilities. On the contrary, our research showed that the amount of clauses in the contracts increase incredibly in order to control something, because of course they have to show their liabilities. And also the picture is again not a very clear picture, because you may have a contractor who may subcontract and then subcontract and then subcontract. For each subcontract, you have all these collection of clauses and rules and exceptions and exemptions and all kinds of complex relations that tries to describe what has to be done and by whom. So our work actually showed that, on the contrary of the expectations, there are more accountability mechanisms, even more than you want to have. But the problem is, because it is so complex to read this picture, that it becomes blurred and nobody can see anymore. And you may remember this fire took place in London a couple of years ago. People are still blaming each other. Who is responsible for what is not very clear. There, I think, we come to this idea of flexibility, because in our work, what we noticed that, on the contrary to this increased amounts of liabilities and accountability mechanisms and so on, what actually counts is the oral agreements between the contractor and the state. And that is very interesting, because if you look at the literature, the expectation also from the practice is that the private sector, of course, is evil and we have to control them. So we have all these mechanisms in the background of writing contracts to control their behavior. However, in research, we realized that for companies, their reputation is more than what is written actually on the contract. So in our research, we found out that some companies actually did more things than they should be doing, because they were somewhere midway the project, they realized something is wrong and they have to change it. So they took measures. And of course, the other way around, more commonly, that we can see on the contrary, complete failures of delivering what is promised in the contract, because the contract is not written very well to provide that promise. So where I'm getting at is that what Jagan called as this approximation of legally binding contracts, this flexibility, it is exactly what the entrepreneurial governance is about, creating this form of flexible relational landscape in which everybody can function. Citizens can function, of course, self-responsibilization of citizens, that now they can actually decide for themselves with whom they are going to deal with. The private sector can also function the way they want, as well as the public sector, and different levels of public sector also show different behavior. So what I'm seeing in the picture that you all contribute to draw is that this flexibility versus the rigidity of the legal language of the contract coming together. And actually, now the question comes to whether a contract can, or collection of contracts can, replace planning, or planning zoning tools is a very interesting question, I think, actually, to reflect from our perspectives. Can we see plans? Can we see zoning plans as replaced by contracts, and then they got better, or the other way around? Can contracts actually replace a zoning plan? Is there a difference according to you? Maybe I will just throw this question and we see whether we get into some new discussion. Jagan.
Thanks for that very provocative question at the end. Just wanted to actually jump in with an observation which I've been wanting to make since Michelle was speaking, about the urban plan. And I think we need to recognize that plans have scale, and that scale matters. And in some fundamental sense, it is scale that decides legality and responsibility or enforceability at different scales. It is determined at different scales. So while most of the zoning that we do is, for instance, from God's eye perspective, we tend to look at the city as being able to be subdivided into sort of blocks and spaces which are of fairly large scale. Ultimately, planning delivers its outcomes at the local scale. And very ironically, in the Indian context, the cities that have created master plans, none of them have created local area plans. And in the planning regimen, there are three scales at which plans have to be prepared. One is a land use plan at the city level, and that's where your broad, larger zoning questions begin to come in. Your regulatory questions about where you can have industries and where you must have protect water bodies and green spaces and so on. And then you subdivide that into zones and then to local areas. And local areas are the scale at which actually enforceability and liability and responsibility and accountability can be defined, but not a single city in the country has prepared those local plans. So I think the scale at which the plan is chosen to be enforced is itself a very interesting choice by the state. And my second point actually was, and when Sukriti was speaking, it really struck me that I think we need to take into account, with regard to something like FSI, for instance, is the FSI as, in a sense, as currency, or especially something that gets thrown up when you look at transfer of development rights, transferable rights, and the interesting equation between rights and floor space, which is actually commodified. Right, so the commodification and also linked to that, the financialization of urban land, which actually is a public good, and the contracts that actually seek to enforce the use or seek to provide concessions on the basis of that, is a fascinating area, which I think again needs a lot of study, especially because TDR, transfer of development rights, is a mechanism that increasingly governments want to use, but are finding it very difficult to use. And oddly enough, it ought to be easy because FSI itself is a commodity. So why couldn't you? The fungibility of this commodity. And my last point linked to that is, I think this to me is the most fascinating thing which has come out of climate discourse and the need for adaptation and resilience, is the discourse around risk. And I think risk gives us a window into a totally new frontier in terms of understanding the contractual relationship between the state and the citizen, because it is taking you into the realm of quantifiability, whereas a lot of that social contract that I referred to till now was not a very quantifiable thing, whereas risk can actually be quantified. And therefore it takes us into a very different realm of public policy.
Questions also. Well, one of the reasons why TDR might not work, first, I keep reading that so-and-so city has it, but that It's never been, there's not many cities that have a properly deep functioning TDR market, so there's not enough research on how to make it work. That's one thing. I don't know how far that's true, but everybody says that. But the second thing is, because the state is making money off of selling FSI itself, and the transactions of buying it, the transaction costs of buying it from the state is actually cheaper. So to some extent, the state is itself in competition with the TDR market. So I think the hybrid stuff makes it very interesting because there's active money involved on all sides. And obviously actors are going to resist any kind of policy change. The other thing I wanted to mention was, I forget who said this, but there was a sense of like, maybe it was who's winning or losing, maybe that was, but what's also interesting about these exemptions is that they're often put in service of social goals. So around the world, these exemptions are being used to build affordable housing, for example, or heritage preservation, green space preservation, and so on. So to some extent, at least, these exemptions are used to build, maybe when I was talking about how this might be suboptimal, but everybody goes along with it, is because they can be used to build sort of cross-class coalitions. Because essentially, yes, the developer is making a lot of money through TDR and these policies, but at the same time, the state is achieving some social goals, right? So your heritage preservation, your slum redevelopment, no matter how suboptimally all that is happening, without those exemptions, it will probably not take place at all. The private sector has no appetite for some of these urban goals at all. So I think that there's also something about these exemptions that can bring kind of competing interests, or interests that would never be able to be served by the private sector together. And then perhaps some of this is precisely because, I don't know if we didn't talk about money, just money, but maybe some of this is also because land has become so expensive that, planning is no longer driving the game. Flexibility. I mean, I don't know where I'm going with this, but there were some points where I was like, all of this is working in this way because land is just too expensive in cities, which I think also has been a kind of seismic change over the last 2 or 3 decades, which coincides with this decline of confident planning, if we want to call it that, and this, extreme, not the power of the private sector, I don't know which came first, or the increasing value of land, which everybody is trying to cash in on as well. Thank you.
Both your insights bring up very interesting connections, just between flexibility and rigidity of regulations, regulatory exceptions, which can be construed as contracts, as I read from Sukriti's insights on, the relationship between the overall regulatory text and exemptions, one versus the other. Exemptions are quite often overspecified. They seem to be catering to particular kinds of lobbies, for instance, or interest groups in many of the cases that I've seen and plans that I've co-led. And between flexibility and rigidity is a lot of the risk hedging that takes place between the public and the private sectors, between public and public organizations, as well as private and private organizations as well. Firms are hedging risks, public agencies are hedging risks onto one another, public and private sector agencies are hedging risks onto one another, and finally onto the society as well. So there's multiple types of risk transfers that are transfers in the sense hedging, literally, that takes place between flexibility and rigidity is what comes across quite clearly from this discussion. And I'm also reflecting on my own work on incomplete contracts. I've shared this with all of you here, that all contracts, as all of you mentioned, all contracts are incomplete. And it is when contracts are incomplete, they give rise to the problem of residual control rights, which both parties or multiple parties that are involved in the contract try and claim, since there are no binding written relationships or even spoken relationships perhaps that exist, or commitments that exist in the space of contractual incompleteness, which is where both parties or multiple parties involved in the contract act in self-interest as opposed to collective interest or public interest. And that gives rise to disputes. It gives rise to cost escalations on projects, for instance, or enforcement of regulations. And that gives rise to a whole range of other scale of problems, including escalated debt for private sector companies, escalated debt for also it's public debt, sovereign debt in many cases, which perhaps are transferred back onto the public. Risk sharing is not very clearly determined because of all the fragmentation that we're discussing, perhaps. So very interesting thoughts over here from all of you. I was also curious to hear a little bit more from Michelle on your thoughts about, Michelle, you mentioned, that there are multiple actors involved in the space of contractual governance, and quite often these are all actors that are not really aligned with one another. And that gives rise to a whole range of, questions pertaining to predictability, for instance. Could you please share a little bit more on that?
Yeah, sure. Well, maybe I want to say something in relation to the discussion before. And I think what's interesting about the contract as a legal form is that it's considered to be creative, flexible, and can be custom made. However, how it's also used is not very creative or very flexible. And I think contracts are very creative legal forms. So why not keep certain parts of the contract open until participation is being organized? Why not make all these contracts publicly available so that people know exactly what's in it? I think sometimes the contracts are considered to be too much of like a private law instrument, just being employed by public actors. And we forget about all the publicness of contracts, and that if you use a contract as a legal form to steer urban planning processes, that they are always public, and that there is also a certain publicness about them, and that a lot of city governments should be way more creative in thinking, okay, how can we use contracts for public goals instead of only using it for more private goals? And in terms of negotiations, I think what you see is, and I think that's a high risk of just replacing like contracts as the legal form for urban planning. What Tuna was suggesting is that contracts are based on negotiations, and it means that some actors are way better positions to do that kind of negotiations than others, and that it requires for municipalities to have a lot of legal expertise and a lot of legal professionals that were able to negotiate with developers and investors. And some investors, of course, can hire the most expensive legal firms to do the negotiations. So I think that's a big risk. And in terms of the citizen groups, you can also see that they find it very difficult to get access to these kind of negotiation processes, and then also thinking contractual terms. And you can also sometimes question, okay, all these decisions are being made in contractual negotiations. Where is the public scrutiny? Where are the democratic processes? But that doesn't mean that we should throw away, I think, the contract as a legal form to steer urban planning processes. But I think we should think way more creatively about how to use them, and maybe invite politicians to join these kind of negotiations, or citizen juries, or I don't know. But we can use contracts way better than we use them right now.
If I may jump in to complete this discussion, because I mean, listening three of you, I keep thinking, I think the intention is very important. Basically between planning or zoning document and a contract. The intention of a zoning contract, zoning or planning document is to protect this way or another public interest. There is no way a plan document would be designed. The intention is to create maximum profit for the citizen, for the public. While when you look at the contract actually is a tool between still the state and the contractor who takes the role. So the state still has that public interest intention, but while the intention continues, that is contracted to a third or fourth company in between to deliver that interest. And there comes the problem, because the intention of that contract, of course, the person, the organization, the actor who is writing it is to protect the rights. I don't know, one of you referred to risk, and I think it's a very, very important aspect here, because public sector at the end has to take the risk altogether. Even if it's a private contract that failed, the public sector still has to pay. Fluberg's work shows us that at the end of the day, public sector always is in the deficit, trying to deal with the consequences of these contracts. So I think those intentions we cannot change. But what we can change, as Michiel was referring to, is to make better use of them, design better processes, because that's a tool we don't actually know very well how to use. I mean, we are lawyers, we are planners, we are regulators, we know how to deal with different aspects, but this is a very different position. We are not in that position. We are not involved in the writing of the contract from that position either. So we need to learn more, I think, as planners and public administrators in the background.
Tuna, I think you brought up a very critical question about the nature of, the ways in which planning itself will get directed if planning becomes a set of contracts that come together, which are shaped more in encrypted ways, contracts in planning, contracts as a way to imagine the planning process itself in ways that are quite insular, addressing particular groups and not necessarily the city as a whole, for instance. And that's a very critical question. Perhaps given your work, I do know your work because I've drawn on your work quite extensively for my own as well. You discuss how fragmentation in governance due to contracts can actually result in very contentious types of outcomes. Could you please share a little bit more about your insights on that, on what you found in the Netherlands, for instance?
Well, we found several outcomes, of course, this fragmentation. Because of the fragmentation, we called the collection of these as the regimes of mini pockets of regulations, pockets of mini regulations, because each contract regulates something. And for each project, you have this new regime, which is not standard. So we were talking about substandardization of urban development overall, while with plans, you can talk about norms and normative perspectives. You can talk about principles, like, for example, you can put a norm of creating 7 square meter green space per resident, or X amount of distance from the school area, whatever. With contracts, it is really a very different set of principles. You can as well put them, and we have seen these kind of public responsibilities in the contractual structures, but they are usually not standard. So basically every contract results in the hands of different actors, and based on their ability to write it very well, it creates certain norm sets and principle sets and so on. So in our work, we were referring to this form of fragmentation. Before I continue, because Michiel put a little note there, and I think we will lose him soon because he has 5%. So maybe, I mean, because this is a recorded session and we are obviously going to edit it further, maybe we can just wrap up the discussion and finish the session, which was extremely interesting and enriching. And also, I would like to know more about your works now more than ever, because this was so interesting to see that we have so many overlaps of outcomes of our research. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, indeed. This was very,
you.
very enriching.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
We'll certainly
Thank you.
continue these discussions.
Absolutely.
Bye.
will.
Thank you, Champaka.
Bye.
Good to know.
Thank you, Champaka, for
Thanks, Champaka.
organizing this. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks,
See you.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Coming to the end of this webcast, let me wrap up with few assertions based on our discussions to feed new research ideas. First of all, we need to pay attention to state-business relations at the micro level of projects and contracts, as the detailed discussion showed us. Secondly, we also discussed that this all means crafting methodologies which engage with empirical nuances as opposed to anecdotal information. We need more data and research in this topic. And finally, urban and regional research education must lay emphasis on the nuts and bolts of urban law, policy, planning and governance in order to promote original research. Thank you very much for your attention for this